Okay, hello everybody. Just got back to my daughters. I like to go fast, so they had some good old rock and roll on, and I'm coming back. But then my gas card did not work at the pump, and I don't like that. Sometimes I leave. I normally, if like the gas card doesn't work at the pump when I'm putting gas, and then you got to go in, it says cashier, I normally just leave. But I didn't really have time, so. But like I'm sure I made a face like, oh, you're kidding me. And so I went in anyway and got my stuff, and I said, I'm going to fill up. And she said, oh, but you have to give me an exact amount because sometimes you could still fill it up, give them your debit card. I said, all right, just 15 should be good. And so I kind of, then it already gets me like going when things are not working properly. We were going to sit outside, but if I remember, I'm going to talk a little bit about that little globe. It'll might fit in with some things. I have the verses from today's date on the Sunday Mass, which is always posted. Right now, they're going up about a week later. So, like on Sunday today, I posted last Sunday's talk because I had the other teachings, which is Kings and Ephesians, the other studies we're doing. All right. I think I'll have Bethany start with the verses from Church Unlimited that Pastor Bill spoke on today. Start on number 1 and read it.
This is Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest."
Okay, that's Matthew 11. That's one of the famous quoted verses. King James, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and you will find rest unto your souls." Now that statement from Jesus, as simple as it is, it kind of is also explains the whole new covenant. The whole story of Scripture is the Old Testament, which we call the Old Covenant, was a covenant where God gave the commandments to Moses. In the story, I'll get some of the verses from the Psalms and the Mass are going to talk about the history of Israel. I'll try to just hit on those. But the whole Old Testament story, all of my teachings on Romans and Galatians, but it was God giving the law to Moses, and then the people of God going through all of this. I call it like a probationary period, not only for the nation of Israel, but for men. And how was it a probationary period? The law was God's perfect standard, God's character, God's righteousness. And they were never able to do it. And it became, Paul the Apostle will teach us in the letter to the Romans, that the law was like a heavy burden. It was something that when they knew what God wanted from man, which is righteousness, holiness, and then the law, James writes in the letter, the one letter in the New Testament, the law it's like a mirror, if you will, but it will expose the sins or flaws of man. And so the more people in the Old Testament or in the Old Covenant, the more they tried to live up to these standards, it was a heavy, heavy burden. Because, if you will, being yoked to the law meant you were in this period of time where you recognized no man can live up to it. Paul will say this various verses in the Bible that say that. Well then, why was it given? It was given to reveal the sinfulness of men to men, to show them that they could never live up to it. But it was necessary for that period of time, we say dispensation, to show men that you're in need of something else. Because you being yoked to the law is a burden. Now, Pastor Bill showed the example of what a yoke is. He had like a yoke, in a, not a real one, but sort of like one that fit around his neck, and he had one of the other people come up and put the yoke around their neck to show that's what that meant. But the verse here, which was the example Bill used, now Jesus is saying to them, you that are heavy laden, you that are under this great burden, come unto me and take my yoke upon you and learn of me. So that's the new covenant of grace. When you now are in grace, you're joined to Christ. We're dead with him. We've been buried with him by baptism into death, Romans 6. And we're now raised to walk in newness of life. So really that whole famous verse, take my yoke upon you, is showing what grace is compared to law. And so you have now freedom. The other thing I'll note, I forgot. I think I asked Bethany to mention something, but I just remembered it. The person that Bill called up on stage, who I do not know, I guess he's one of the staff at the church, but maybe Bill didn't realize it, but that's really a perfect example, because the person's name was Aaron. Okay, Aaron was the brother of Moses, and what we call the old law, we call it the Levitical priesthood, or the Aaronic priesthood. So these were the priests that came under the law, and they're referred to as from the tribe of Levi, but also we say the Aaronic priesthood. So Aaron, that came from the name of the brother Moses, was a type of the law priest. Okay, so that was a good example that Bill had a man by the name of Aaron, because that kind of is a little example of what I just taught. If you're yoked to the old covenant law, you're under bondage. But now we get Aaron is no longer, we're not yoked to the law anymore, but Jesus, take my yoke upon you. So that was a good little example. And then I'll just have you read the verse that's in number 3 of that outline. Read the one from 1 John 5.
Okay, this is 1 John 5, verse 3. Love God, means keeping his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome.
Now, John wrote that in the New Testament, understanding this whole principle of grace. And if you love God, you will keep his commandments. And hey, Anthony, you can sit in if you want. I just started.
I'm working on the well.
Okay.
In and out.
If you love God, you keep his commandments, and they are not grievous or burdensome, showing that we now fulfill the law, as opposed to the old covenant. That was a burden because they were not changed. They didn't have the conversion to be truly new creatures. But now John is writing, now that we're in this new covenant of grace, we do keep his word and his commandments, primarily love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and might, love your neighbor as yourself. Paul himself, again in Romans, says on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So, all of a sudden we're new creatures in Christ, and the law is being fulfilled in us because we are now sons of God, which John also, 1 John says, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Okay? Every man that has this hope in him purifies himself, even as he is pure. So we have that hope that the Lord's going to come, and that's actually going to be the verses from the Mass. Now, those are the only two I'll do. Really, Bill he didn't have a whole lot more verses, but that's what he kind of hit on today. The verses, let me do them from the Mass. First, 1 Corinthians 1:3, verse 3 through 9. These are a lot of the greetings that Paul gives to the churches when he's writing those letters to the Christians. And in that one, again, it's a common greeting, but I thank God for all of you. He says that to all the churches, all the Christians that he was preaching to, the ones we covered in the book of Acts. He says, I'm grateful to God for what he's done in you and the grace that he's given you through Jesus Christ. and that you come behind in no gift. Now, he's writing this to the Corinthian church, and that you are enriched in all utterance, that's King James, in all speech, and in all knowledge. He says, so God has given you through Jesus Christ all of these gifts we all possess in speaking and in having the knowledge of God. In Corinthians, Paul will talk about having this wisdom that we have as believers that the world does not have. And so this is a gift that we in the church have, believers in Jesus Christ have. And the greeting simply says, God began this work in you. There's other places Paul uses the same phrases. He says, and he that began a good work in you will fulfill it till the day of Jesus Christ. That God's going to confirm this work that he's done in you as we wait for the Lord to come back. Now, these are the verses from the Mass. So the theme, the Catholic Church and some of the we refer to as Orthodox churches, which are maybe more of the old-time churches, which are fine, they celebrate, right now begins what's called a season of Advent the coming. So what do we celebrate as Christians? The first coming, okay, Christmas, the birth, the incarnation, but also at the same time we celebrate looking forward to the return of Christ, which is a historic belief, which I also believe in, is of the second coming, okay? The second coming of Christ. So this is kind of like the theme of these few verses I'll hit on. So Paul says, we're all living, and we're living also with these gifts that God has given us. Why did he give us these gifts as Christians? Because we're going to occupy. We're supposed to take the gifts. A lot of the parables I spoke about the last few months, and these gifts are intended for us to use them to advance the kingdom and the work that God's called us to do. Let's see, Mark 13. I could have Bethany turn to it, but she might not be able to find it really. Mark 13, 33 through 37. Maybe you could start at verse or two before, because Jesus is again talking about the second coming in this passage. And he says, no man knows the hour or the day. I think that's verse 32. He says, not even the Son, but only the angels. Then he says, this, talking about the second coming, Jesus himself speaking about it. And he says, it's like a man that goes on a journey. So the Lord has left, he has ascended, but this is what it's like Jesus is teaching. He goes on a long journey, and then he calls his people to him, and he gives everyone authority and gives them charge. And then there's a porter, it says in the Old English, porter, like a doorman or somebody at the door. That's when the master leaves on this journey. He says, here's the goods. A common theme, the theme of the talents, a parable of talents we taught last week. So, then he goes away, but he gave to us, you see, that's how it fits with that Corinthians verse. He gave to us all this wisdom and all this knowledge that we possess as Christians, and then he's going to come back. But it's important, in that passage it's saying, for us to be ready, for us to have fulfilled the task that God has given to us. So when he comes back, we're not taken by surprise. So that's a common theme. Now I asked Bethany, and I'm going to comment on the ones from Isaiah, and the only other verse from the Mass was Psalms 80. I forgot, again, what I asked Bethany to remind me of, but I'm remembering something that's an example from out here. I come to Bethany's house, not only to teach, but sometimes during the week I come out here and I do a nice long walk, and it's by the water. And there's verses that say in the book of Proverbs, consider the ants. Look at the ants. This is in the book of Proverbs. We also get things in Proverbs about spiders, locusts. Solomon, who wrote that book, it's a book of wisdom. There was a famous preacher by the name of Jonathan Edwards, comes to mind, and he's associated with what we refer to as the Great Awakenings, which in the 1700s and 1800s in our country, you had what we refer to as the Great Awakenings. It was like a revival period. And Jonathan Edwards actually was one of the preachers that God had used. Famous history. I did a little about Puritans last week and all. But he wrote, it just comes to mind, he wrote a whole book about spiders and all types of interest. I never read it, but the book of Proverbs, which is a wisdom book, says, consider these things. Locusts, consider spiders. That they take a hold in king's palaces. That's like divine placement, okay? And you see these spiders different places. What about the locusts? They go forth by swarms, you see. That they're kind of small, but look, even in the Old Testament days, you had locust swarms, and look, it can wipe out entire things. But what about the ants? Consider the ants. It's one that came to mind. When I was walking here the other day, have you ever seen an ant pile? Bethany. Mm-hmm. Okay. Have you ever seen spiders and other things? Okay. Now, have you ever seen an ant pile? This is what I saw the other day. Of course, I never really thought of it. Where the ants were just sitting around. Now, sometimes spiders are just in the web. I have never seen an ant pile where I'm walking by. The reason I normally recognize them is, what are they doing? They're like bipolar. That's what I thought the other day. Because I'm walking here, and I'm passing a few of them up, and I don't kill them. I used to kill them in the past. I said, they are nonstop. They're going to get something. They're going to, the little things. And I thought about that. I said, they are always about the business of their particular purpose. And I never see them just sitting around on that ant pile. Right. Sort of like lounging, like today we're going to take a day off. And so one of the wisdom you can get from that, which actually comes from the proverb, is they're always busy. They're always making preparation, and they're not waiting for like, oh, it's harvest time and we don't have anything. We didn't prepare. No, they're all the time. And that's an example that's actually would fit in with some of these verses. Not that we're supposed to run ourselves ragged, which is the yoke of the law, but when you're yoked in grace, Jesus said in John's Gospel, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. And he was not talking about natural food. He was actually saying, my energy, or what keeps me going, is I've come to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. And so he was driven by fulfilling the purpose that God had, that the Father had. All right, now the ones in Isaiah, they're not maybe, the mass reading from Isaiah was Isaiah 63, verse 16 through Isaiah 64 through verse 7. It's kind of the theme with this, and along with the next one, which is Psalms 80. It's not so much, it's like they went through a period of judgment, God's people. They went through a period of hard times, and they're calling upon God. Even if we're forsaken, but God's our God. Come again. Remind us, God blessed them in the Old Testament, gave them the temple, gave them the sanctuary, said we had all of these things, Anthony said that, and yet now the enemy has come into the land and has taken us. And so they say, come down from heaven. They're calling upon God. This is the passage from the prophet Isaiah, and like it gives a little reference. It says like when water is boiling, that's how they're calling upon God to come down. So it's more of God. They went through a judgment period, and they're saying, now we've lost our temple. The heathen now have got our land. The enemy has come in. But you initially blessed us with all these things, and why have all these things happened? It's kind of like Kenneth said. The famous, two famous verses, I didn't write them, but I'm trying to remember them. Okay. One in that Isaiah passage is famous. It's, eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those that wait for him. Now that's famous because Paul, the one I quoted from Corinthians chapter 1, if you go to Corinthians chapter 2, which was not the reading in the Mass, but actually it would probably fit better because that's the quote. Paul quotes this Isaiah verse in Corinthians 2, but he changes it a little bit. Eye has not seen, neither has ear heard, nor has entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those that love him. The passage from Isaiah said those that wait. The one from Corinthians, Paul quoting it 500 years later, they that love him. But then if you continue reading in it, it says, but God has revealed these things to us by his Spirit. So human wisdom, that's kind of a theme, actually, some of it in Corinthians. Human wisdom cannot really grasp these, the knowledge of God, the wisdom of God. God gives these things to us as a gift. And that's why I might discuss a little bit about the globe. Let's see, the little globe, because I heard a radio show and it's going to remind me. The last verse from the Mass was Psalms 80. It's kind of a long psalm. Just so happened I read it myself the other day. I've been going psalm through psalm, and so when I opened up my bookmark to the psalm, I'm going to review the one from the Mass. It was right in those pages. But that psalm, there's a couple of verses I have quoted, but visit this vine. The theme of that psalm is this. God took the people of God, the Jewish nation, Israel. He took them out of Egypt, delivered them. The whole story I talked a little bit about, Moses getting the law. Well, it was when God took them out of Egypt and these great things happened. And then he took them into what we call the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. And you read about that conquest in the book of Joshua. So God took these people and he brought them and he gave them this great promised land that was theirs. And they had all these wonderful things as the nation of Israel. But then during periods of time they came under judgment. That's the history of the Old Testament. And so in this psalm they're saying, you took us sort of like a branch or a vine, and you took us out of this place of bondage, Egypt. You planted us in this new land, and we as a nation grew. And the branches reached all the way to the rivers, all the way to the oceans. This imagery you see a lot in Scripture. And so the people of God, like a garden, like a field, and it says, and we were doing so good. And then, of course, judgment came. And that's kind of like the theme of that psalm, and it says, but visit this vine, visit this vineyard, visit this branch again. It's one verse in there says, visit the man of your right hand. The fulfillment of a lot of those things came when Jesus came. As the root, he's called the root of the offspring of Jesse. He came forth as the fulfillment of a lot of these prophecies that were given to them. But the psalm that a few weeks ago I was always worried that I accidentally would quote it, I couldn't even remember it the other day, but that's when I quote, like, if I can't sleep at night, there's many verses to quote, and I kept thinking, well, which one should I quote? Because there's too many, so I figured I'll just stick with one. That way I'm not, like, already not sleeping. Sometimes I'll wake up at 2 or 3 or whatever, and I'm like, it's too early to get up. But Psalms 1, blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Now listen, for he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the day of judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And once again you get the image of the tree, of the branches of the vine. And so in Scripture that's applied to people and the church. And so what they're saying in Psalms 80 is we were this beautiful, beautiful planting, God, and then what happened? The hedge broke down, the walls came down, the enemy came in, and that's his periods of judgment. Those are all of the verses, which I will, 24 minutes, I will just add all of those verses. Psalms 1 is practical, the one I just quoted. It's saying if you meditate, you're walking in God's ways, then everything prospers and you bless, and that's really a biblical principle. Why the little, and then we'll end, and I might talk real quick science. I noticed somebody made a post or a comment the other day, and I'm happy to see, it was like a friend on Facebook, that I don't really talk that much, and I'm sure it was fine and all, but it reminded me of a few other things that came up recently as I'm going through a lot of courses. I regularly go through a lot of courses, and some are just from if you order courses from what's called the Great Courses Online, look, those are all top university professors, and look, it's a great deal because I'll go through those things, and I paid whatever, $30 for, so those are valuable. And then sometimes when I put the radio on, especially I like to listen to the news, but if there's something of value, if it's not the news, then I would like, besides putting on my rock and roll when I'm driving, I want to talk radio, maybe public events and things. But on Saturdays, it's usually terrible, and it gets me a little mad because trying to catch something of value, and it's like the cigar show. You know, we're going to talk about smoking cigars for 1 hour. I mean, like, you know, and I smoke, but I smoke cigars sometimes, but I don't want to talk about smoking cigars for an hour. Sure enough, I'm putting it on yesterday, and the normal talk show in this area, it had something stupid on. And then I said, well, I'll try another one. And it's a new show. I think it's called Fantastic Science. And I'm listening to it. And it's a time that normally there's nothing of value on. And it's very famous physicist, scientist. I would not be able to pronounce his name, but I'm familiar with him. You see him on a lot of the shows. And he's interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an astrophysicist, which I'm like, oh, this is great, you know, and I was happy that they were, it's kind of a new show. And as I listened, some of the presuppositions that people have, the one little comment that I saw one day was how science is really the answer and the solution to the point where, and it was somewhat critical of those that believe in God or religion or philosophy or whatever, that science is really the answer. Now, this has happened before in the field of thinkers and science, that some before in the past, and they've kind of now realized, oh, that was a mistake, because science, I said the other week was knowledge, but knowledge of the things that we look at in the natural realm, we get a lot of good stuff from that, like I gave the example of the ants. But that in itself, of course, apart from what we refer to as ethics, philosophy, theology, of course, that in itself doesn't fill in all the lines. And as I was listening to this new show that's on, I was grateful that they're starting to have something of value. And I don't listen to just pick holes, but I kind of taught a lot of this stuff before. And as they were having the conversation, which I was grateful for, then they talked a little bit about what might hold us back, meaning in any future advancements of science. They weren't real critical, but they said maybe like Christians or people who believe in God, they were kind of alluding that they might hold back science. So now I picked up on that thought that they come up with. And then they gave one example, without getting too political. They didn't want to do it on the show. But they said, for instance, stem cell research. And there's a lot of great things. And what they're talking about, they're talking about how many people do indeed have a problem, particularly using parts of fetuses or aborted children. Now, the reason that's problematic to some in the field that think about ethics, and science certainly has ethics that need to be thought about before we do certain experimentations on people and so forth. And so they were kind of saying, if we allow like religious views to hold us back in our advancement of science, particularly people that might question whether we should just wholesale begin using aborted baby parts for all types of things, because there could always be a danger that it is possible, and that was what they talked about in the stem cell thing, there could be a danger if even if science could advance to a point where you could have a lot of benefits from parts of fetuses, there could be a danger that sometimes you might have a society where you are not thinking of the ethical choice. Was it right to actually abort or kill that child in the third trimester? And then if there's a lot of benefits that you might say we're getting out of these bodies of these children that are now aborted, okay, do we want to go really far down that road? But I noticed they kind of were hinting, these are intelligent men, but they were hinting that people that have maybe questions about how far should we go in experimentation on humans and so forth, they were saying that could hold us back. All right, I didn't get too critical, but I know where they're heading with that. Then the next question they had, these are very intelligent men now, Neil deGrasse Tyson and the other guy that's speaking to him, who is the host of the show. Then he said, and what about possible alien life? And I understand they talk about that as well. And then the conversation said, well, if we ever do find alien life, or alien life, if it's ever even in an advanced form, the same conversation then said, if it's advanced alien life, would it be good maybe for them to interact with us in our society? Because after all, our human society, they were critical of us in a sense, we have treated our fellow man brutally in our history. Now wait a minute. That was said by Neil deGrasse Tyson, meaning he was talking about ethics. All of a sudden, he transitioned out of rejecting philosophy, God, ethics, religion. He kind of criticized it, and then in the very next statement, in a discussion about interacting with other possible alien life forms, he said maybe it wouldn't be good because humans have a very bad track record of abusing or killing other human beings. Now, I understood the mistake he made. I agree with him. Humans have done wrong to other human beings. And that's called ethics. That's called morality. That's the very thing that a few minutes earlier he was kind of criticizing. That some humans, Christians and others, have questions about how we treat the unborn. And he was critical of that. That could hold science back. But then the next statement, he was saying, well, it might not be good if another advanced civilization, whatever, ever interacted with us because we have a bad track record on how we treat fellow humans. Now, I caught that. I caught his contradiction. Not meaning he's not an intelligent man, because he is. But immediately he transitioned out of the field of science, which some were propagating, it will solve all man's answers. If we could just get rid of the barriers of religion, theology, God, and philosophy. And then the next statement is an ethical one, a moral one, a religious one, if you will, that the treatment of our fellow man. And so now I caught it because I've kind of studied that, and I'm not saying it to just be critical, but I'm saying it that there's a reason why science alone is never the answer. Because science alone, which is a wonderful thing, and it's knowledge, but it's our day, it's how we are observing physical things, the universe, things around us. That's a wonderful thing. But without ethics, without how we're treating, how what are the effects of the things, experiments or whatever, then, and that's called ethics. And science has ethics within it. So you can't just throw that out. And the little thing of the globe, I'll give you that one example. When I was here, when I was here yesterday, I noticed this. I think it was yesterday. And I told my daughter, because I like collecting things, and of course, what's the first thing you do? This is like a floating globe. So first thing you do is you touch it. And I did. And then I was like, oh, I think I broke it, because she was sitting outside. And then she's telling me there's a certain way you got to fix the globe. She'll fix it in a little bit. So I kind of, laughed at that a little bit, like I messed up. But if you look at that thing right there, I'll tell you, and I'm going through some of the courses right now, and it's reminding me, and these are just, like I said, fine courses. But if you look at that thing that I just showed you, and if I were to ask you, I've taught a lot of this before. We taught Aristotle last week, cause and effect. We taught the laws of logic, all fit in with science, because what we understand as there's a maxim, ex nihilo nihil fit. What that means is out of nothing, nothing comes. Now that's never going to change, okay? That's science. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Now, if I showed you that little globe just now, and I asked you, where do you think that came from? Now, we know where it came from. Somebody developed it, had the idea, and they made it. But if I actually told you, no, that thing there, which is very small, that thing there did not exist 1 million or 2 million years ago, or 3 million years ago. But one day, after a very, very long period of time, as much as you want, one day I walked out to the little water spot here, and it was there. You would not believe that to be possible. As a matter of fact, that would be, I would say, almost scientifically impossible. But some would say, no, that would be absolutely impossible. The reason I would say almost scientifically impossible is because that thing is made out of matter. That's an actual thing there. But it has design, and it's quite obvious because it has all that design. Some smart person marketed it, manufactured it, produced it, and sold it on eBay or Amazon or whatever. But there's a slight possibility that that thing could have showed up on the Oso by itself, though it's very slight. Why? Because everything that is out here right now, the Oso, the ocean, the grass, and the trees, all of that is actually considered part of what exists now. Meaning, you do have a universe, you do have a planet, you do have an atmosphere, you have matter. You have things in existence now. So, perchance, over billions of years, maybe these things of matter and physics could have accidentally come together and made that, though it's slim. Most people on the street who are smart, and like the science show I like to listen to, and I'm grateful it's on, most people hold to a view that the actual Earth, the actual planets, the actual solar system, all that is so interesting when we look at the fabric of the cosmos and everything. Most people are believing that all of it did indeed come from nothing. Now, one of the verses in Corinthians says, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. The foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. I would just tell you this is a scientific fact. It would be absolutely scientifically impossible. There's a slight possibility that that could show up over 1 billion years by itself, because we already have an existence now. But for that, or for the whole real thing, the universe, solar system, everything, galaxies, for all of that to have come from a point in history where there was absolutely nothing is a scientific impossibility. It's a scientific impossibility. Now, the debate on the age of the universe and the age of the earth, I don't debate all those things, because I think if we could understand, and really it was the breakthroughs of Albert Einstein, believe it or not, in the 20th century, that showed us we did not know scientifically what I just told you until the 20th century, okay? For many hundreds of years, thinkers and scientists, we talked about Aristotle last week, they didn't have scientific proof that there was a time where there was absolutely nothing, okay? Einstein showed us that. Einstein showed us there was a beginning point to time and space and matter and energy, that there was a starting point. These were really the great breakthroughs of the scientist by the name of Albert Einstein. And his theories were somewhat questioned, but now they're accepted science. And if you had a beginning point, and we refer to that as the point of singularity, okay, in the common terminology of Big Bang Theory, which I accept that. You had a beginning point called singularity. Right before that point, you had nothing. You didn't have a cosmos. You see, you didn't have a fabric of the cosmos, which is a nice term. And to have nothing, and some scientists have made the mistake. I'll tell you, I had a debate maybe 7 years ago on a particular website. And on that debate, people, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to do this, but I kind of did a little bit of it. And some guy who claimed to be a physicist, he claimed to be a scientist, and he basically made the argument that what we refer to as, I taught all this when I taught the quantum physics, okay? Quantum mechanics. But he basically said, we now have proof that something comes from nothing. And he was talking about what we refer to as the quantum leap. And he said, because the quantum leap shows us that at one moment something disappears and reappears, that's called a quantum leap. Therefore, something has come from nothing. Now, I made a comment. I said, you don't have nothing. In your example, you're saying something is coming from nothing, but you're starting from something. You see, the universe is something, you see. It's not nothing. You might think to the naked eye, the universe is nothing. So let's go find a place in the universe where nothing is. And if we could go find a place where nothing is in the universe, let's examine that place for 1 billion years. And maybe something will pop into existence from nothing. The problem is you can't find a place where there is nothing, okay? The universe is something. That's kind of a mistake people make. The universe, you cannot find a pristine environment anywhere where there is, quote, nothing. There are things that you cannot see with the naked eye, but according to science, it's already something. And sure enough, I made that argument, because how smart that man was, or whether he was a scientist, I don't really know. But that's how I debunked his argument. We have scientific proof something comes from nothing. I said, and where do you have your nothing? Where is your laboratory where there is nothing? Okay. Everything now is existing. Even anything you observe is already existing. That's why you could never get that from some point in time where there was really nothing, okay? And then another scientist corrected that man. Now, I'm not saying it to brag, but I'm saying it that a lot of people are falling down the line where science is a really great thing, but some are arguing again that science alone is the answer to all things. And many of those men are making contradictions, okay? And the thing I quoted a minute ago, out of nothing, nothing comes. That's science. That's not faith, and that's not religion. Meaning if you really had nothing, meaning not even some being, the supreme being, if you didn't have something that was self-existent at some point in the history of everything, then you would have nothing today. Okay? Now, people used to argue scientifically that the universe itself was that thing that has always been. Some argued, there was, I think Bertrand Russell might have, some people have said, well, if something has to have always been, which you do need something that has, then he said, why can't it be the universe? Why? Well, because science has shown us. Science has shown us it wasn't always there. You see, science itself is telling us in our day that you need what's called a necessary being. Something had to always be in order for there to be something today. That is science. That is science. And when men, whether it's Hawking or anybody else, tries to say, I'm telling you through science that it all came from nothing, that's unscientific. As a matter of fact, you could ask a 5-year-old kid, where do you think that came from? The kid in kindergarten. And none of them would, as far as I know, they're smart enough to, none of them would say it just popped there by itself. And so some of the people that are falling for this in our day, they're kind of duped into that. True science and real science is tremendously great, but don't let somebody, and that's kind of the conversation I heard on the radio yesterday, don't let them trick you into believing something that is absolutely unscientific, absolutely against what we know. And so that's why you have what we refer to as a necessary being. Logically and scientifically, something that was non-material had to always be. You say, well, why couldn't have that something, God, have also had a beginning point? Impossible. Because if there was a point where the necessary being, God, did not exist, then you couldn't have anything. You see, nothing can come, you could never get something from a point in the past where there was absolutely nothing. And I'll quote the last verse, Hebrews 11. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. So the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. That's Hebrews 11, written 2,000 years ago. The things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. So everything you're looking at was not made from some material thing. It was made from God, the Word of God. And science tells us everything here came from something that was non-material. And there are many great thinkers and scientists who believe in God, okay? But those who are rejecting God, if you were to ask them, what did you have before the point of singularity? They have absolutely no scientific answer whatsoever. They can't answer that at all. And some have come to the point where they realize they can't answer it, and they say, well, that's not a matter for science, because we're only dealing with the physical realm. We're only dealing with observable things. Okay, so you're telling me that you're a scientist, and you're going to have all the answers for us, and you have no explanation for what there was before the point of singularity? You better come up with something, because then you can't give us the answers, and that's all right.
So you have gotten online and you've debated.
Oh yes, this is
so what I was going to say. There's a lot of people that always just say, "Well, how do we know the Bible's real? Like it's just a bunch of things people made, and we have to make mistakes."
Yes, I like
What would
it.
you tell somebody that just absolutely doesn't even believe the Bible?
Oh, I can't move it. I was going to move it over there. Well, that's a whole nother field.
I know,
When you start in this one that I just did for a little bit, we call it apologetics, and it deals with that. It deals with, also we can get into, then, once you go down this whole road of the short, brief little thing I just did, once you begin seeing, okay, now we have to give serious thought to the existence of God. And even the atheists, Richard Dawkins, he's not an idiot, he's a physicist, a British physicist, but Richard Dawkins himself kind of got stumped once by an interviewer. And they asked Dawkins, now you understand, and look, like I just explained, we all understand. Anybody that has any knowledge at all understands that there was a time where you didn't have anything. Okay, the atheist thinker, that's a big, he doesn't really have an answer. So Dawkins, they asked him once, well, you realize there was a point where nothing was here? Correct. And there was, what do you think started it? Do you think maybe it was an alien life form? And Dawkins says, that could be it. See, that was like a way out for him. Maybe an alien life form initiated it from, and then they asked him, and what do you think this alien life form was intelligent? And this was an interview he had. He said, well, yes, probably had to be intelligent. Do you think he was around forever? You know, probably has to have been around forever. He explained God, the attributes of God. Now, this is an atheist. Why would he even have gone down that road? Because they realized this is a big problem, what I just explained in a very short way. That you had to have a necessary being. Okay, you can call him an alien. We call him God, and I'm certainly not comparing God to an alien. But then, once that hurdle is overcome, which it's not hard to overcome it, then, but you got to get people back on track because they're maybe listening to a good show like I did yesterday, and I caught that contradiction from one statement to the next. And to me, it's an arrogance that Anthony didn't catch the explanation I gave you. But to me, there's an arrogance when a scientific man, he's a smart man, makes a statement that you don't need ethics, you don't need, and then in the next statement he's talking about ethics. They don't realize they're making those mistakes. And if they were humble enough to say their field is science, good. But then you want to comment on philosophy and theology, and you yourself have no knowledge of those fields, then you can't, as a scientist, jump into philosophy and theology and then begin critiquing those fields and saying we don't need those fields anymore. You're making the same mistake that you're accusing others of. That, well, science is... No, you yourselves have made a lot of scientific blunders, and I just explained one of the most basic ones. Science has never told us all this came from nothing. No, that's scientifically impossible. And the average person is actually still believing that. Okay, once that point is made, which religion is the true religion? How do we know the scriptures? That's a whole nother field, documentary evidence, history, I do that as well. That's another whole long thing that we get into. But the historical evidence for the Bible, and for the history, which I just told, the whole book of Acts, the book of Acts has a lot of court proceedings in it. The book of Acts, in this book, that book was written 2,000 years ago. It was written in the Greek language by a man by the name of Luke. Okay, in that book of Acts, in this New Testament, in this whole Bible, has history, has courts. The birth of Christ talks about Caesar and the taxing and the census that was made. Okay, you have, particularly the book of Acts has a lot of historical documentation of court proceedings, things at the time that took place in the first century. Now, there were also some smart men. One was called Sir Ramsay. And he decided to embark on, he didn't believe in God, he didn't believe in the Bible, but he believed that we can go and document test what's in the Bible. Let's look at the historical court record of Luke that he says Paul went before this one and that one. I just taught all this at the ranch. And then when he researched it, yes, there was enough to go back to the first century, Rome, look at the official proceedings, look at the names of streets, and historically critique what was written in the book of Acts. And he said he later became a believer. Sir Ramsay was his name, because he said, sure enough, just like you would go back to any historical document as much as you can go back and look at it, it proved reliable. So that's called the documentary evidence. Then we also have what's called the archaeological evidence. There was a long period of time where some of the names of kings and coins and things, even certain cities that were mentioned in the Bible that we never had archaeological evidence of them, and over the last 80 or 100 years, a lot of that showed up. So these are other ways that we then begin to say, this is how we know Scripture is reliable. Okay, just like you would look at any other historical document. All right, that's a little apologetics. Any questions, Anthony?
No.
Yes, ask something about. I know Anthony likes the science
shows, yeah.
and what is the most interesting scientific thing right now that's interesting to you?
Probably that Hadron Collider.
Okay, I talked about that maybe about a year or so ago.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was kind of a big thing, actually.
Yeah.
What does it do? The atom?
Like
the
Atom smasher?
Mhm.
Yeah, there's like finding
Finding
small
out
particles.
that there's even
Yes.
more particles. Than
And that's
just
all
the
good
atom.
stuff to actually.
They think like
I'm
the
glad
answer to the beginning would be in that somehow.
I've talked a lot about that, and I won't do it all now. All of that is good. That's all good science. There was some political. I kind of showed at one point that they invested a lot of money. It's underground in Switzerland and France, somewhere right there. The Hadron Collider, which was famous a few years ago, they threw a lot of money into it, and a lot of people that were critical at that time because there was a financial crisis pretty much going on, the Greek crisis and all, and they were saying, you're throwing all this money into it, you better justify it. And the initial test they did, the smashing of the atoms, the collider leaked, meaning they had a huge physical problem that cost a lot of money. It didn't do it correctly. Then they had to go back and fix it after the initial test run. And at that point, politically, a lot of people were like, you want more money now? It was like pressure that they had to come up with what they were looking for. Now, and I like reading the science manuals and all, when they finally did the test, where they said, we found it, initially, I forget the panel of scientists, but initially, one of the scientists said, no, we didn't find really what we're looking for. Then later on, they said, okay, we got it. Now, I always wondered if there was political pressure, like there is in anything else, of whether, because I remember when I followed that, like, okay, we found it, and I saw the explanation for it. It's been a while since I looked at it, but that's all good stuff. And I mean, it's good as long as they're honest and they're not being pressured to do things. I've often said, even regardless of any, I'll link I did a whole post on quantum mechanics, but it showed you a lot of the presuppositions that come to the table that a lot of people in the scientific field don't realize they have these presuppositions. And then when you begin to just have this kind of debate, if they're honest, they'll admit, okay, yeah, we do have some of our pre-thinking that's also affected us. Some in the scientific community, and certainly not all. The majority of the scientists during the time of the scientific revolution were Catholic priests. It was the Jesuit order. And when you go back to the Renaissance, Reformation, and scientific revolution, and then all the modern period of thinkers and philosophy, but out of all of the scientists during the time of the scientific revolution, the majority out of any one group, the most were Jesuit priests, okay? So you could say that the foundations of the modern scientific method came from the church, came from the Catholic Church. And so it's interesting that it was men who believed in God and dedicated their lives to God that really made the advancements that we know of today. Okay, I don't want to go too long. This is already like an hour.
Oh,
So let's pray.
All right.
All right. Father, thank you for letting us do another teaching. There's a lot of stuff we talked about today. I guess that verse that I quoted in Hebrews would be the